At 4:17 a.m., the Caribbean was still wrapped in darkness as the USS George Washington moved at a steady 20 knots, its deck quiet, its systems running with the kind of precision only a U.S. carrier strike group maintains before sunrise. Nothing unusual, just another routine patrol, as Washington continued tightening its grip on the drug routes fueling the Venezuelan regime. The kind of calm that usually lasts longer than 5 minutes. Not today. 3 Venezuelan fast patrol ships burst out of the dark engines, straining as they cut directly across the carrier's bow. They swung into a tight V-shaped barricade, a maneuver so dramatic it felt designed for television, mainly the television inside Venezuela. Their approach locked into classic attack geometry, the kind small navies use when they want big reactions for small cameras. The carrier strike group did not react. It simply held course. When you displace 100,000 tons, you let others do the swerving. But as those patrol ships barreled closer, the real question emerged: were they testing American steel, or just hoping someone somewhere was filming the attempt? Like and subscribe to Titan Navy, so you do not miss what happens next. The attempted blockade in front of USS George Washington did not happen in a vacuum. It unfolded inside a larger strategic pressure campaign that had been tightening around Venezuela for months. Under Operation Southern Spear, the United States expanded its naval footprint across the southern Caribbean, positioning destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, surveillance aircraft, and carrier strike groups to crack down on the drug routes long tied to the Maduro regime. Every patrol, every radar sweep, every interdiction forced Caracas into a smaller and smaller corner. Some regimes respond quietly. This one chose theater. And it was not just a maritime campaign. Washington, under a renewed hardline approach, declared Venezuelan-linked cartels and their enablers narco-terrorist networks. They dumped hundreds of thousands of people into the United States from their prisons. Nobody is in love with the people running Venezuela. We love Venezuela. We love the people of Venezuela. But what that regime has done to this country is a different story. The policy shift opened the door for more aggressive intelligence operations, broader military support for regional partners, and a mandate for American forces to intercept, document, and shut down smuggling routes before they ever reached U.S. shores. In other words, the Caribbean was no longer simply an ocean. It had become the forward edge of border security. For Caracas, that shift was unacceptable. Maduro needed political oxygen, and he needed a distraction that did not require firing a missile or risking a war he could not win. What he did have was a state media machine hungry for footage that could make a small navy look defiant against a superpower. Enter the tactic of choice, close-in visual provocation. It costs nothing, risks little, and if the opponent overreacts, it can be spun into a propaganda victory for years. That is why 3 Venezuelan fast patrol ships pushed into the path of a 100,000-ton U.S. carrier. Not because they expected the carrier to flinch, but because they hoped someone in Washington would. A harsh maneuver, a course change anything that could be edited into a triumphant broadcast back home. It was a calculated gamble wrapped in nationalistic theater. And like most risky performances, it depended on the other side doing something unwise. But the United States is not in the business of providing free campaign material for adversarial regimes, and that created a very real challenge for the American strike group. The U.S. Navy held overwhelming firepower: Aegis destroyers, layered air defenses, ASW helicopters, and a carrier capable of launching combat aircraft every 30 seconds. Against that backdrop, the Venezuelan patrol ships were little more than metal props in a political play. Yet despite that superiority, American commanders had to operate inside a paradox. They had to show strength without giving Caracas the overreaction it was fishing for. Too soft, and it sends the wrong message to every cartel militia and proxy in the region. Too firm, and Caracas would gladly scream U.S. aggression into every microphone it could find. This is where the political instinct of Trump-era policy comes into play. The administration emphasized forward pressure deterrence through presence, and the idea that America protects its borders not just at the Rio Grande, but in the Caribbean, before the first kilo of cocaine ever gets within 1,000 miles of Florida. A carrier strike group holding its course under provocation is not just a naval decision, it is a statement of national posture. And Venezuela understood that. That is precisely why its patrol ships were ordered to get as close as possible without firing enough to create noise, not enough to invite consequences. But on the ocean, intentions only matter until metal gets too close to metal. As those three hulls tightened their V-shaped barrier in front of the George Washington, there came a moment when political messaging collided with physics. The situation was no longer about narratives or televised bravado. It was about collision geometry, safe passage law, and the responsibility of the U.S. Navy to prevent an avoidable incident while refusing to yield even a single degree of course. That was the moment when the tone shifted, because when diplomacy, restraint, and patience meet their limit, the next message is delivered not by spokesmen or press releases, but by the guided missile destroyer USS Gravely, already accelerating forward to draw a hard line of steel across the sea. The moment the Venezuelan patrol ships tightened their V-shaped barrier, the balance of the encounter shifted, and the responsibility to reshape it fell to USS Gravely, a guided missile destroyer built for moments exactly like this. Until now, Gravely had held a quiet escort position, maintaining spacing on the starboard edge of the formation. But, with the carrier's path being deliberately obstructed, silence was no longer enough. The destroyer increased speed bow, cutting a clean line through the dark water, angling directly into the narrow space between the George Washington and the encroaching Venezuelan wall. It was not a rush, it was a calculation. Gravely accelerated with the controlled confidence of a warship that knows precisely what it is and what it represents. She is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, one of the most capable surface combatants afloat, carrying the Aegis Combat System, SPY-1 radar vertical launch cells packed with SM-2 and ESSM missiles, torpedoes, and a 127mm 5-inch gun that can reach targets miles away. But in this moment, none of that was the weapon. The weapon was the hull. The weapon was position. The U.S. Navy calls it position, not provocation. It is a strategy built on discipline, hold speed, hold course, block the unsafe maneuver without escalating to weapons or fire control radar. Let your presence, not your trigger finger, reset the geometry of the encounter. It is the difference between a professional navy and one desperately fishing for footage. Gravely's bow crossed the invisible threshold, first sliding in front of the Venezuelan formation with the precision of a scalpel. It was a direct message written in steel: this lane is not yours to control. The Venezuelan patrol ships now faced a choice. They had hoped to avoid either alter course or risk a collision with a 9,000-ton U.S. destroyer that was not about to blink. Suddenly, the theatrics became less cinematic for them and more practical. Inside the George Washington's Combat Information Center, the Aegis displays updated every fraction of a second. The system recalculated the closest point of approach as Gravely sliced into the intercept line. The screen looked less like a military console and more like a high-speed chessboard. Each ship, each course, correction, each surge of engine power was a move. Some smart, some reckless, and some that only looked brave if you ignored physics. From the Venezuelan perspective, The hope had been simple force the carrier to yield even slightly to create the illusion of leverage. A few centimeters of course deviation could become a triumph on state television. But the Americans did not waver. The carrier held its path with unwavering momentum. The destroyer moved like a knight, jumping into blocking position, and the Venezuelan commanders suddenly found themselves playing the wrong game. There was a quiet intensity across both bridges. On the Venezuelan ships, crew members braced at the rails, cameras rolling in the hope of capturing something dramatic, preferably something they could spin later. On Gravely's deck, sailors maintained the same posture they would have during a routine transit. No panic, no raised voices, just the professionalism of a crew that had performed similar maneuvers near Iranian fast boats, Chinese interceptors, and Russian cutters. Venezuela was not the first nation to try this, and it will not be the last. But there was a clear difference. The U.S. destroyer was not improvising. It was executing a playbook refined over decades of confrontations in contested waters. Gravely's navigation team adjusted just enough to deny the Venezuelan formation any path forward without allowing the situation to tip into aggression. The bow wave alone made the point. Firm, unavoidable, unmistakable. In the span of a minute, the attempted blockade lost its shape. The wall no longer blocked anything, and Caracas's carefully staged camera moment suddenly looked much smaller against the silhouette of an Arleigh Burke moving confidently into place. Yet the encounter was not finished. Not even close. Because while Gravely controlled the surface picture, the real advantage the U.S. Navy holds in situations like this comes from above. And at that very moment, the thump of rotor blades began to rise from the deck behind them. The steel wall had been built. Now the sky was about to come alive. While USS Gravely reshaped the battlefield at sea level, a different kind of power was preparing to enter the fight, one that did not rely on armor tonnage or bow waves. The sound came first, a deep, rhythmic thump rolling across the deck as the MH-60R Seahawk spun up its rotors. The helicopter lifted from the destroyer with the steady grace of a machine built for war but trained for restraint, rising into the pre-dawn air with a full suite of tools that modern navies fear far more than gun barrels. Beneath its fuselage hung the essentials: FLIR, imaging a surface search radar electronic support measures, and a live data link stitched directly into the Aegis network aboard Gravely. The Seahawk was not just airborne, it was connected, woven into the destroyer's combat brain, able to update the tactical picture with every turn of the rotor. As it climbed, the helicopter banked hard and began circling directly over the line of confrontation. From above, the situation looked very different. The tight formations, the bow angles, the accelerating wakes each told a story, and the Seahawk recorded all of it. The FLIR camera swept across the Venezuelan ships, capturing heat signatures from engines pushed near redline. The radar traced their course adjustments, confirming that the patrol vessels were not just lingering, they were pressing in. Every piece of data streamed down into Gravely's CIC in real time. Within seconds, operators could see more than the naked eye ever could: slight changes in bearing, throttle surges, turret movements, even crew clusters on the Venezuelan decks. In a tense standoff, information is not an advantage. It is a weapon. And right now, the United States held all of it. The psychological pressure was unmistakable. Whatever the Venezuelan ships did, accelerate, slow turn, or rotate a gun mount, the Seahawk saw it. And what the Seahawk saw, Aegis recorded. That meant any reckless move from Caracas could instantly become legal justification for U.S. self-defense, documented by sensors, more precise than any camera crew filming propaganda on a deck below. For a regime expecting a media spectacle, being surveilled by a helicopter that never blinks was not the preferred angle. Meanwhile, on the water, USS Gravely moved to its next phase. No firing, no radar lock, just escalation by posture, the kind of escalation that speaks for itself. The destroyer's 5-inch gun slowly oriented forward, a deliberate rotation visible from miles away. The ship's electronic warfare suite powered up its sensors, glowing with the unmistakable signature of a vessel shifting into a higher readiness tier. Nothing aggressive, nothing ambiguous, just a gentle reminder to the Venezuelan crews that pushing further would be a decision they could not take back. This was how the U.S. Navy fights, when it chooses not to fight. It uses information instead of intimidation position, instead of provocation, and the simple unspoken understanding that if force is required, it will not be a symmetrical exchange. The broader message was unmistakable. The United States did not need missiles or warning shots to dominate this encounter. By combining the steel of Gravely with the surveillance reach of the Seahawk, the Navy showed Maduro something he cannot match: the ability to control the battle space without ever pulling a trigger. Above the waterline, the Seahawk kept circling its calm orbit. Below it, 3 Venezuelan ships continued pressing into a narrowing corner, shadowed by sensors that saw every twitch of their engines. Which raised the question that defined the next phase of the confrontation: at less than 4 nautical miles, who would blink first? The crews clutching cameras on Venezuelan decks, or the American sailors holding formation, as if nothing had changed at all? The standoff reached its most dangerous phase the moment the range dropped below 4 nautical miles. At this distance, the ocean stops feeling vast. Engines grew louder. Wakes stretched long and bright beneath the slow rise of dawn. Even subtle adjustments began to look deliberate. The Venezuelan patrol ships pressed forward with unmistakable urgency, white spray kicking off their bows, deck crews clustering at the rails, with cameras and binoculars gunners lingering near their mounts. Everything about their posture suggested they were hunting for a single dramatic moment they could spin into national television triumph. USS Gravely, by contrast, looked almost serene. Its deck crews moved with the steady cadence of a ship following procedure rather than performance. No rushing, no gesturing, no theatrics. Professionalism became its own form of psychological pressure. When one side tries desperately to appear bold, nothing undermines that act more effectively than an opponent who refuses to acknowledge the show at all. Then came the quietest escalation of the encounter radio silence. Neither side initiated bridge-to-bridge communication. The Venezuelan captains avoided it because speaking aloud meant owning their maneuver. The Americans avoided it because they understood exactly what Caracas wanted: an audio exchange that could be clipped, framed, and repackaged into propaganda back home. Without dialogue, the tension sharpened, but the narrative control remained entirely with the U.S. Navy. What unfolded was not a conversation, but a test of nerve. Who would reveal weakness first, and who would dictate the next move? Inside Gravely's CIC, the tactical picture remained crisp. The Aegis system tracked every subtle shift in the Venezuelan ship's wakes, measuring bow angles, throttle surges, and micro-adjustments in speed with clinical precision. The computers displayed numbers. The sailors reading them understood the stakes. They were watching a foreign Navy gamble national pride within collision distance. At last, when the legal and tactical threshold had been satisfied, Gravely transmitted a standard open-channel maritime warning. No ship named, no raised tone. Just a clear procedural boundary. The American formation was operating lawfully in international waters, and vessels near the strike group were required to maintain a safe distance. The message did not break the tension, it crystallized it. Like a thin line drawn across the sea, the transmission made clear without threat or theatrics that the United States was precisely where it was permitted to be moving exactly as international law allows. In that single quiet act, responsibility for what happened next shifted unmistakably onto the Venezuelan captains advancing from the dark. Venezuela's response avoided the one thing they could not control: recorded voice. Instead, their patrol ships hoisted signal flags, a theatrical flourish clearly designed for audiences back home rather than for any operational purpose. It was the maritime equivalent of shouting into a camera while pretending not to hear the microphone being offered to you. For viewers who will eventually see this footage, one essential fact cannot be overlooked. The U.S. carrier strike group remained in international waters the entire time. That meant the United States had every right to hold its course, speed, and formation. By refusing to yield, the carrier was not provoking. It was safeguarding the rules that keep global navigation and commerce stable. When a superpower gives up space unnecessarily, the consequences ripple far beyond a single morning in the Caribbean. Today, it did not. Then, almost imperceptibly, the sensors recorded what human eyes could only confirm moments later. The lead Venezuelan vessel eased back its throttle. Its bearing shifted by a few degrees. The ships trailing behind mirrored the adjustment. The once solid V-shaped blockade began to sag, then open. The confrontation moments earlier teetering on the edge of miscalculation dissolved into the ambient rhythm of the sea. No broadcast declarations, no triumphant reversals, just a slow, reluctant retreat. And on the radar display, those tiny deviations carried a message louder than any public statement. In the Caribbean, sometimes victory is measured in degrees, quiet proof that steel discipline and resolve outlast theatrics every single time. The retreat unfolded the same way the confrontation had begun, quietly, deliberately, and under the watch of American censors, recording every detail. As the Venezuelan formation loosened, the once rigid V-shape sagged into an uneven line. One ship slipped outward first, then another, then the last. Their throttles eased, their wakes thinned, and the distance between them and the American strike group widened with every minute. No flags signaling defeat, no radio acknowledgments, no theatrics on the open channel, just three silhouettes peeling away from a fight they knew they could no longer shape. For USS George Washington and her escorts, this was not a celebration moment. It was confirmation that discipline outlasts provocation, and that a carrier strike group can defuse a crisis without ever touching its arsenal. No missile warnings, no flares, no forced maneuvers. The United States had held its course from start to finish, and the Venezuelan Navy had quietly stepped aside. Placed back into the broader context, the encounter was far from isolated. It was one chapter in a much larger arc, unfolding across the Caribbean. Ever since the United States expanded its presence under Operation Southern Spear, these waters have become the front line of a pressure campaign designed to choke the financial lifelines of cartels and, by extension, the Maduro regime. Carrier strike groups, Coast Guard cutters, P-8 patrol aircraft, and Navy destroyers patrolling these routes are not just hunting drug runners. They are dismantling the shadow economy that keeps hostile actors afloat. And here lies the part many Americans understand instinctively. When the United States pushes outward, it keeps trouble from reaching its shores. This is the doctrine of distance embraced strongly in recent years, especially under leaders who viewed cartel networks not as mere criminals, but as narco-terrorists capable of destabilizing entire regions. A strong naval presence is the outer wall of American border security, stopping cocaine, fentanyl money, and weapons long before they can fuel violence or addiction inside U.S. communities. What happened this morning was simply the visible edge of that strategy. The U.S. Navy executed it with the balance Americans expect firm enough to send a message disciplined enough to avoid the propaganda trap. Venezuela tried to create footage of an American carrier blinking. Instead, what they filmed, whether they choose to air it or not, is a destroyer holding the line, a Seahawk watching from above, and a strike group maintaining heading with unshakable resolve. While analysts will dissect the geopolitics, there is a quieter story running beneath all of it, the human one. The sailors aboard George Washington and Gravely had been on station long before the confrontation began. Many had stood watch through the night eyes on radar scopes, hands near communications panels, performing routines so practiced they become muscle memory. Their job does not end when the engines of an adversary quiet. It does not ease when a standoff dissolves. Even in their off time, they study, drill, and maintain systems that must work perfectly when tensions spike, like they did this morning. Life at sea is a cycle of readiness, one that rarely receives the spotlight, but defines every moment of peace the Navy secures. Across the Caribbean, the message traveled fast. Allies saw a United States willing to stand firm without stumbling into escalation. Cartels and paramilitary groups saw something else, entirely a superpower that is not intimidated by proximity to Venezuelan waters, and will not adjust course simply because a few patrol boats try to stage a spectacle. In a region where perceptions shape behavior as much as firepower, the signal was loud. American resolve still frames the boundaries. And that brings us to the strategic layer hovering above the entire incident. The quiet minutes before sunrise, when 3 Venezuelan ships pressed forward and 3 eventually pulled away, will echo far longer than the encounter itself. They will shape how regional actors measure risk, how allies interpret American commitment, and how adversaries calculate their next move. In the Caribbean, sometimes the most powerful message is the one delivered without a single shot fired. In the end, the story of this morning is simple. 3 Venezuelan patrol boats tried to block a U.S. carrier. USS Gravely stepped forward to hold the line. A Navy Seahawk watched every move from above. American systems rose quietly to higher readiness, and Venezuela eventually throttled back and turned away. No shots fired. No concessions made. The carrier never altered course. The message is larger than the moment. Victory at sea is not always about firing first. Sometimes it is the discipline to stay on the planned route, to defend maritime law and freedom of navigation, even when provoked just miles from an adversary's shoreline. This is the backbone of Operation Southern Spear, a strategy that targets cartel revenue pressures the Maduro regime and shields American communities by stopping narcotics long before they reach U.S. borders. The tension will not vanish. Caracas will push again for propaganda footage, and the United States will continue meeting these encounters with controlled strength that can shift from stillness to multi-layered response in seconds. The image is unmistakable. A carrier strike group holding steady before sunrise, its sailors standing watch, so the nation remains secure and unmatched on the seas. If you want more breakdowns of real-world naval confrontations, do not forget to like and subscribe to Titan Navy. See you next time.